for inviting me to present at the CEES 2012. I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Hello, my name is William Mook, and I'm here today to talk to you about solar-assisted Burgess process as a bridge to a sustainable energy economy for the China Energy and Environment Summit. Thank you. Ed Drake and Pete Wilson made the first profitable oil well in 1859. Even though by today's standards, this well isn't much to write home about, it is a very important well in the history of energy. In 1859, oil was not the expensive, dirty form of energy that we think of it today. In fact, relative to the sources of energy available in 1859, oil was clean, low cost, and easy to use. As a result, oil use skyrocketed from 1859 to the present day and lifted billions of people out of poverty. Ed and Pete reinvested their profits from this first well, even though it was only 21 meters deep, and they used a hand pump to collect the oil in the bathtub. Within 6 years, the entire Pioneer Run Creek Valley surrounding Titusville was covered with oil wells owned by these two. Of course, increasing investment means exponential growth, and that means eventually saturation and depletion. Today, there's little evidence that Titusville ever was the source of the nation's oil supply. What applies to Titusville applies to all oil wells, in fact to all mining and recovery operations from nature. We produce what's called a logistic curve. And applied to oil, this is the famous Hubbard curve. Oil output peaked in the United States in 1975, will peak in OPEC countries in 2018, has peaked in non-OPEC countries as of 2004, and total production worldwide will peak this year, 2012. Once that happens, the economic conditions of the world will change radically, as they changed when we reached the inflection point in 1970s. At this point, we'll need an alternative to oil. Our supply situation is reflected in the oil price history since its discovery in commercial use. As we can see, the early stage of development led to lower prices until steady state was achieved, and then the breakdown crisis occurred in 1972. We need an alternative that is as abundant and as inexpensive as oil and as easy to use as oil to sustain growth. Today, the price of discovering and bringing to market a barrel of oil is $70 a barrel. At this price, the industrial economy of the world shrinks at 2.5% per year in order to pay for this oil supply at this price. For economic sustainability, we need to have oil at $35 per barrel or less. It is at this price that we have 0% growth. Over the history of oil, we've had $18 a barrel oil in inflation-adjusted dollars, and we've maintained a 4.7% growth rate at this price. Of course, lower prices, if they were achieved, would lead to higher rates of growth. As mentioned previously, 1972 was the beginning of the breakdown crisis. We can see this here when we look at the world production divided by population, which broke at that time. On this scale, 1967 had a specific ratio of barrels of oil per people, and this ratio is attempted to be maintained by political and military action since 1985. This ratio shows the productivity of individuals is also fixed. Shortly after 2012, the peak, we will not be able to even maintain this level of engineered stability. And after this period, unless new alternatives are found at low price and in great abundance, we will not have the stability we see today. The scale required, the scale of the problem is shown by this graph. Here we show 4.7% growth. This is the same distribution curves that we saw, production curves that we saw before, but on a logarithmic scale. And to make up the difference needed to maintain this low price energy, we needed to start in 1950 to begin alternative energy production in competition with oil. It needed to equal half the U.S. output of oil and energy in 1980 and half the world's output by the year 2000. Today, 2/3 of our energy should be coming from alternative forms, and 1/3 that we now produce should only be a minor role in our energy production, and this should be done at less than $18 a barrel equivalent. So how do we do it? How do we create alternatives to oil that's in abundant and as low cost as oil? Well, we need a high temperature nuclear source of energy. Since Stefan Boltzmann shows us cost is inversely proportional to the fourth power of temperature, we need to take that high temperature nuclear source through a thermolysis or electrolysis or a combination process to break down water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then use hydrogen to synthesize hydrocarbon fuels. High temperature nuclear sources include high temperature fission reactors like that used in the NERVA rocket, jet or cycle fusion like that used in the Ivy Mike fusion explosions, or concentrated solar power. The sun is a fusion source with a 5778 Kelvin surface temperature. Any of these can be used to break down water into hydrogen and oxygen, and that hydrogen can be used to combine with carbon dioxide to produce hydrocarbon fuels, or combine with carbon to make hydrocarbon fuels as well. Absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere and combining it with hydrogen reduces carbon dioxide and closes the carbon loop, and using coal or other carbon sources to combine with hydrogen increases CO2, and of course using hydrogen directly as a fuel produces no CO2. Those three processes, producing two different fuels, hydrogen and hydrocarbon fuels, give us absolute control of the carbon cycle, or at least human impact on it. For the past 16 years, I've been working with the concentrated solar energy, that being most conveniently available to me, to drive a electrolysis process. The concentrated solar is 55% efficient, since I use several parts of the solar spectrum to generate electrical energy. Initially, I used mylar-coated aluminum dishes that I spun on lathe to concentrate the sunlight, and this achieved $1 per peak watt. I then went to a aluminum coated plastic reflector that achieved 25 cents per peak watt power, and then migrated to water filled micro lens arrays to concentrate sunlight. With this system, I was able to achieve 3 cents per peak watt, giving me competitive access to conventional energy at today's prices. The sheets of water-filled lenses concentrated sunlight to a photovoltaic unit that broke water down into hydrogen and oxygen through a high-temperature electrolysis process. The hydrogen was gathered and used to synthesize hydrocarbon fuels from coal using the Burgess process. This I term solar-assisted Burgess. This allows us to produce a significant amount of hydrogen and pay for it. In combination, this entire process produces oil at $8.57 per barrel, which is highly competitive in today's market. This cost allows an economy based on this process to achieve 10% growth rate. We capture sunlight, focus it to a concentrated photovoltaic module. That module produces DC electricity. We also capture rainwater runoff and gather that into a collection point, and then apply the DC electricity to the excess water captured and gather the hydrogen that's created. This hydrogen is combined with coal in a Burgess process to produce crude oil, which is then refined into petrol and other usable petroleum products. This means that we must look at both the sunlight and the rainfall of any location we are to install a facility. And in China, this is in the southwest portion of the nation near the Great Desert region, but also overlapping a high plains region as well. The primary capacity is around 400,000 square kilometers of collectors, consisting of 134 billion solar panels, each 2.4 meters by 1.2 meters. Water is collected from rainfall, which is converted to hydrogen. The hydrogen is gathered and stored in depleted gas and oil wells, and which also mobilizes gas and oil in those wells, and then sent to power plants throughout China and burned in those power plants instead of coal. Coal is then stranded, and that coal is combined with additional hydrogen to produce petroleum products. So this is the first phase in achieving energy independence and energy dominance for China. Despite the use of coal in this way and the continued use of petroleum, carbon footprint can be cut by 70% in China by adopting this approach. Today, China uses 3.2 billion metric tons of coal each year, 9.6 million barrels of oil per day, and 2.92 trillion cubic feet of natural gas per year. I'm proposing that we replace the 3.2 billion metric tons of coal each year with 447 million metric tons of hydrogen each year, produced with solar panels and rainwater. We then make 54.3 million barrels per day of crude oil products with 265 million metric tons of additional hydrogen each year at the former coal-fired power plants using the stranded coal, and then reinvest the profit, as in Titusville, to achieve tremendous rates of growth. So starting with only one 200,000 barrel per day facility in 2018, we'll have a total of 272 such facilities by 2030 and make China the world's largest oil exporter at that time. This can be financed in the existing energy markets and futures markets with the appropriate structure and make use of the $40 trillion of liquid assets held by the world's 10.1 million millionaires. This is the earlier chart showing production and the peak today at 80 million barrels per day, and this supports a $10,000 per person per year GDP, or gross world product, GWP. By 2030, according to this Hubbard curve, this will drop to around 50 million barrels a day by conventional means. So an additional 50 million barrels should be well received at relatively high prices, around $70 a barrel at that time. If China makes this available at $18 per barrel using today's pricing, this will restore the 4.7% growth rate of the world's economy starting at that point and give continued dominance to China. China can also sell oil internally at cost of $8 to $9 a barrel and maintain a 10% growth rate there. So their per capita income can grow relative to the rest of the world, even as the world grows. Over this period, from 2030 onward, China will then supply the world with increasing amounts of hydrocarbon fuels as well as hydrogen fuel, along with the technology to make use of those fuels. This is all from the proposed infrastructure that we just saw. With a 400,000 square kilometer limit, we are limited to approximately 779 million barrels of oil a day equivalent. And that will be achieved at 4% growth rate in the year 2080. So this will allow China to maintain dominance using totally internal resources from this time till then. Just as nature can be saturated in its ability to produce, human beings can also be saturated in their demand for products. And at $75,000 per year, we achieve that. So we have two phases that we can look at. One is the internal growth, where we reinvest and the money that we make selling oil at around $70 a barrel, just under what it takes for oil companies today to discover and bring oil to market. And then a second phase where price is lowered to restore economic growth rate worldwide, which is beneficial to China, and drop the price to $18 a barrel while maintaining very low prices within China of approximately $9 a barrel to maintain growth there. During the first phase of internal growth, we'll use coal, and during the second phase, we'll use CO2 to produce hydrocarbons, and then of course we'll also develop hydrogen-fueled vehicles to make use of hydrogen as well, and appliances. It should be remembered that even during the internal growth where carbon is used or coal is used directly to make hydrocarbon fuels, since the Burgess process in this case is solar assisted, the reduction of carbon is cut in half or less in the case of China. Thank you.